You ruined everything. Do you understand that? Everything. My son David stood at the gate, gripping the iron bars so tight his knuckles went white. His tuxedo jacket was gone, tie hanging loose around his neck, sweat dripping down his forehead. He screamed at me through those bars like I was a stranger. Behind him, wedding guests streamed toward the parking lot in confusion. Then Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, appeared, her white dress swishing as she ran up behind David. She screamed at him, "Your mother destroyed our wedding. Are you just going to stand there?" I stood perfectly still on the other side of that gate, phone still in my hand, staring at the son I'd raised for 31 years. I said quietly, "You locked me out of your wedding, David. I just stopped paying for it." He froze. His face crumbled like a little boy who'd just realized what he'd done. Then he said the words that cut deeper than anything else that day. "Because you don't belong here." Those words hung in the air like poison. I stood there, frozen, after hearing what just came out from my son's mouth. 40 years of sacrifice and love became something my son needed to escape from, shutting me out from the wedding I paid for. If you want to hear stories about family, heartbreak, and what happens when secrets finally come to light, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Have you ever been shut out by someone you thought would never hurt you? Let me tell you how we got here. My name is Gladys Mercer. I'm 62 years old, and I've spent most of my life in the catering business. I started when I was 19, right after David was born. My husband, Hank, and I worked every holiday, every weekend, every hour we could get. We wanted to give our son a better life than we'd had. David is 31 now, and I spent those 3 decades thinking that working hard meant loving hard. I missed his soccer games because I was serving food at someone else's celebration. I missed his school plays because another family's event needed me there. I missed parent-teacher conferences because I was setting up for a corporate banquet. I told myself David understood, that he knew everything I did was for him, that someday he'd look back and realize the sacrifices we made were because we loved him. But looking back now, I wonder if he saw it differently. If those empty seats in the bleachers felt like abandonment. If my exhaustion at the end of 12-hour shifts looked like indifference. If he thought I cared more about strangers' parties than his childhood. I never asked him. He never said anything. David was a quiet kid, sensitive. He didn't complain or make demands. I thought that meant he was easy, content, happy even. When other parents talked about their difficult teenagers, I'd smile and say David was no trouble at all. I thought I was lucky. I thought we had a good relationship. But somewhere along the way, he stopped talking to me about things that mattered. I noticed it when he was in high school. He'd shut down when I asked about his day. He'd give me one-word answers. He'd leave the room when I tried to give him advice or share my thoughts. I told myself it was normal teenager stuff, that all kids pulled away from their parents at that age, that he'd grow out of it and we'd be close again once he matured. He didn't grow out of it. He just learned to smile through it. He learned to tell me what I wanted to hear so I'd stop asking questions. College created even more distance between us. David came home less and less. When he did visit, our conversations felt rehearsed, surface level, polite but empty. I'd ask about his classes, his friends, what he was doing with his life, and he'd give me just enough information to end the questioning. Brief summaries, no details, no real connection. Hank told me to give him space. He said young men needed independence, that David was becoming his own person, and that was healthy. But I felt something else, something colder than just independence, something that felt like rejection, though I couldn't have named it at the time. I remember one Thanksgiving during his junior year. I'd worked a double shift the day before and I was exhausted, bone-tired. I burned the turkey. It was dry and overcooked, and I felt terrible about it. David made a comment, half joking, about how I was never really present even when I was home. He said it with a laugh, like it was supposed to be funny. I laughed it off too. Hank quickly changed the subject and started talking about football. But David's face stayed tight, tense. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Like he'd said something he'd been holding inside for years, and no one had heard him. No one had acknowledged it. No one had asked what he really meant. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know, if I'm being honest. I was too tired to have that conversation. Too tired to face the possibility that I'd failed him in ways I didn't understand. I wish now that I had. I wish I'd sat down with him right then and asked him to tell me everything he was feeling. Maybe things would have been different. After college, David moved to the city. He got a consulting job that paid well. He started building a life that didn't include us very much. He'd call once every few weeks. The conversations lasted 10, maybe 15 minutes. He'd ask how we were. We'd ask how he was. He'd say work was busy. We'd say we missed him. He'd say he'd try to visit soon. Then he'd have to go. Always something else he needed to do. I told myself he was busy, focused on his career, building his future. I didn't realize he was building a life that specifically excluded the parts of himself he associated with us, with me. He was creating distance on purpose, protecting himself from something I didn't even know existed. Then Vanessa entered the picture. Vanessa came from the kind of wealth that didn't just change David's circumstances. It changed his identity. Old money. The kind of family that had vacation homes and country club memberships and connections that opened doors. I saw the change the first time he brought her home. David was different. Stiffer. More formal. He stood differently. Spoke differently. He corrected my grammar mid-sentence when I was telling a story about his childhood. He apologized to Vanessa for Hank's casual clothes, even though Hank was dressed perfectly fine for a Sunday afternoon at home. He looked embarrassed by the house he grew up in, the house where we'd raised him with everything we had, the house we'd worked ourselves to exhaustion to pay for. Vanessa was polite, but she was detached, distant. She complimented our home the way someone might admire something quaint and temporary, something you'd see in a museum but never want to live in. She said things like, "How charming," and "This must hold so many memories," in a tone that made it clear she was glad it wasn't her life. I tried to connect with her. I asked about her family, her interests, and what she did for work. Her answers were short, careful, guarded. She gave me nothing real to hold on to. David filled every silence with nervous energy. He talked too fast. He laughed too loud at things that weren't funny. He kept steering the conversation away from anything that might reveal too much about where he came from. After they left, I told Hank something felt wrong. He said I was being overprotective, that I needed to let David live his own life and make his own choices, that Vanessa seemed nice enough and I should give her a chance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that David wasn't just dating Vanessa. He was becoming someone Vanessa could accept, someone who fit into her world. And that person didn't include the mother who raised him. That person didn't have a working-class background or parents who worked in catering or a childhood spent in a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood. Over the next months, David's phone calls became shorter. His visits became less frequent. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd say he was fine. Just busy with work, just busy with Vanessa, just busy with life. But there was something else in his voice, a guardedness, a wall he'd built that I couldn't get past, like he was protecting something from me. I didn't know what, I didn't understand that he was protecting himself from my judgment, from my questions, from my expectations, from the version of himself he thought I'd see and reject if I looked too closely. He'd convinced himself that I wouldn't understand his new life, that I'd criticize his choices, that I'd make him feel guilty for wanting something different than what we'd had. None of that was true, but he believed it, and that belief became the wall between us. David called one evening to say he was engaged. I cried with joy, real tears, happy tears. My son was getting married. I asked when I could help with the wedding planning. What colours had they chosen? What venue? Did they have a date yet? Could I help with invitations or food tastings? David hesitated on the other end of the line. The pause stretched too long. He said Vanessa's family was handling most of it. They had a wedding planner. They had connections. Everything was under control. I offered to contribute what we could. Even if it was small, I wanted to be part of it. David said that wasn't necessary, that they had it covered. I felt a small sting, but I pushed it away. I told myself he was just trying not to burden us. But 2 weeks later, he called back. His voice was different, tight, strained. He said the Langfords expected a family contribution, $40,000. I couldn't breathe for a moment. That was our entire life savings. Every penny Hank and I had saved over 40 years of working ourselves to exhaustion. Our retirement, our security, our safety net. Hank said absolutely not. I remember the look on his face when David said the number, the colour drained from his cheeks, the way his voice cracked when he said we couldn't empty our entire life savings for one day, that it wasn't fair to ask us for that there had to be another way. But David pushed. He said it wasn't just about the wedding, it was about respect, about showing Vanessa's family we were equals, that we were serious, that we belonged. I heard something else in his voice, something deeper than the words he was saying. Desperation, shame, fear. Like he was trying to prove something I didn't understand, like his entire future depended on this money, on us saying yes. I overruled Hank. I can still see the betrayal in his eyes when I said we'd do it. But I couldn't let David down. I couldn't let him feel like we weren't supporting him. I told David I'd transfer the money, but only if I was listed as a co-signer on the venue and catering contracts. I said it was about protecting our investment, making sure everything went smoothly. David hesitated. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. But he agreed. I thought I was being smart, responsible. I didn't realize I was giving myself the only leverage I'd ever have, the only weapon I'd have when everything fell apart. I transferred the money in 3 installments over 2 months. $10,000 the first time, $15,000 the second, the final $15,000 a month before the wedding. David thanked me each time. He said we were amazing, that he couldn't do this without us. Vanessa's family was so impressed, but the gratitude felt hollow, empty, like he was reading lines from a script, like he was saying what he thought I needed to hear. The months that followed were strange, unsettling. David stopped answering my calls as often. When he did pick up, the conversations were brief, clipped. I asked about wedding details. What did the venue look like? What flowers had they chosen? What was the menu going to be? He said they were handled. Everything was handled. I asked if I could meet with Vanessa to help with anything. Maybe go dress shopping together, or help with seating charts or favors. He said Vanessa was overwhelmed with work and wedding planning, that she didn't have time. I suggested a small dinner, just the 4 of us. Something simple, just to connect. David said he'd check their schedule and never followed up. I called back a week later to ask about it. He said they'd been too busy, maybe another time. I felt myself becoming an inconvenience, something David had to manage rather than include, someone he dealt with out of obligation, not love. What I didn't know was that David had been lying to Vanessa's family, building a completely false version of his life. He'd told them his parents were difficult, overbearing, controlling, that his mother had boundary issues and didn't understand personal space, that his father was rough around the edges and sometimes inappropriate. None of it was true, not a single word. But David needed a narrative that explained why his family wasn't like theirs. Why didn't we fit in? Why did he seem uncomfortable whenever I called? Why didn't he talk about us much? David had also hidden his past from them. He'd rewritten his entire history. He told the Langfords he'd gone to private school on full academic scholarships, that he'd been at the top of his class. Those opportunities had come easily to him. He didn't mention the loans Hank and I took out to cover what the scholarships didn't, the loans we were still paying off. He said he'd travelled through Europe after college, backpacked through France and Italy and Spain. He didn't mention the semester he'd struggled with depression and had to come home so we could take care of him, the months he spent in our spare bedroom, barely able to get out of bed, the therapy appointments I drove him to, the nights I sat with him when the darkness felt too heavy. He built a version of himself that was clean, accomplished, uncomplicated, effortless, and I represented everything messy he'd left behind, everything he wanted to forget. Eleanor Langford had concerns about us. She'd seen the address where we lived. She'd heard the way David talked about his childhood, or rather, the way he didn't talk about it. She told David that his family didn't fit the image they wanted for the wedding. Too working class, too plain, not polished enough, not the kind of people their social circle would understand or accept. She said it would be awkward, that it might reflect poorly on Vanessa. Maybe it was better to keep things simple, keep things clean. David agreed with her, not because he believed it, but because disagreeing felt like losing Vanessa, losing the life he'd worked so hard to access, the life he'd lied to get. When Vanessa suggested limiting our involvement in the wedding, David didn't fight it. He nodded. He said that made sense. And when she said maybe it was better if we didn't attend at all, David hesitated. I learned about this later. He hesitated for maybe 30 seconds, but only for a moment. Then he agreed. He said okay. He said he'd handle it. He convinced himself it was about protecting his peace, about setting boundaries, about finally taking control of a relationship that had always felt suffocating to him. He didn't realize he was cutting out the only two people who'd ever loved him unconditionally, the only two people who'd ever put him first, who'd sacrificed everything for him, who'd never asked him to be anything other than himself. Hank and I drove 4 hours to the vineyard on the day of the wedding. I wore the navy dress I'd bought special for this day. I'd spent weeks looking for it. I wanted to look nice, presentable, like I belonged. Hank wore his only suit, the same one he'd worn to my mother's funeral, to his brother's wedding, to every important event in our lives. We arrived 90 minutes early because I didn't want to miss a single moment of my son's wedding. I wanted to see him before the ceremony, maybe help him with his tie, tell him how proud I was, tell him I loved him. When we reached the entrance gate, a security guard named James stopped us. He stepped in front of the car. He checked his tablet and shook his head. He said we weren't on the approved guest list. He said it politely, but firmly, like it was just a mistake, like we'd gotten the date wrong or showed up at the wrong venue. I explained I was the groom's mother, that there must be some kind of error. James radioed someone. We waited in awkward silence. A woman in a black suit appeared minutes later. professional, cold. She introduced herself as Catherine Wells, the head steward. She confirmed that Hank and I were flagged as denied entry, not just absent from the guest list. Flagged. Deliberately blocked. She said the decision came from the groom and the bride's family. Her voice was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing a scheduling conflict. I asked if I could speak to David, if there was some misunderstanding. Catherine said the groom was preparing for the ceremony and couldn't be disturbed, that he'd given explicit instructions not to be interrupted. Hank raised his voice, something he rarely did. He told her we'd paid $40,000 for this wedding, that we had every right to be there, that this was insane. Catherine's expression didn't change. She didn't even blink. She said financial contributions didn't guarantee attendance, that the guest list was at the discretion of the bride and groom. I looked up toward the venue and saw David standing on the balcony. He was far away, but I could see him clearly. He had a champagne glass in his hand. He was watching us, watching this entire scene unfold. I called his name, loud enough that he had to hear me. He heard me. I know he did, because he turned his head slightly and looked directly at me for a long moment. Our eyes met. I saw recognition there. I saw guilt. Then he turned and walked back inside. Just walked away, like I was a stranger, like I was nothing. Vanessa appeared next to where he'd been standing. She leaned on the railing. She looked down at me and smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It wasn't apologetic. I was satisfied, triumphant, like she'd won something, like she'd successfully erased me. I stood there at that locked gate trying to understand how we'd arrived at this moment, how the son I'd raised, the son I'd sacrificed everything for, the son I'd loved with every fibre of my being could do this to me. I thought about every soccer game I'd missed because I was working, every late night I'd come home too exhausted to ask about his day, every sacrifice I'd thought was love. I wondered if David had spent his whole life resenting me for things I never knew hurt him. If he'd been carrying pain I couldn't see, because I'd been too tired, too busy, too focused on survival to look for it. If all those years of working for him had felt like abandonment instead of love. I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. I scrolled through my emails until I found the catering contract, the one I'd insisted on being part of. I was listed as a co-signer with full financial authority. I called Jeremiah Dauphin, the catering company owner, directly. His number was right there in the contract. I explained that I was denying further payment authorization and withdrawing my financial guarantee, that I was revoking my approval for services to continue. Jeremiah was confused. He asked if I was sure. He said this was highly unusual, that the event was already underway. I said I was absolutely sure. He said if I was serious, they'd need written confirmation, legal documentation. I typed the email standing at that gate, with my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the right keys. I spelled out exactly what I was doing and why. I hit send. 10 minutes later, chaos began. If you want to see what happened next and hear how this story ends, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Have you ever had to make an impossible choice between protecting yourself and protecting someone you love? I watched from outside that gate as a manager approached the bar and quietly spoke to the bartenders. The service slowed. Then it stopped completely. Waiters began gathering in the kitchen. Catherine's radio erupted with urgent chatter. The catering manager walked quickly toward the Langfords and asked for immediate payment verification to continue services. $40,000 had been the foundation of the entire payment structure. Without my guarantee, the remainder was due up front. Guests at cocktail hour started asking questions. The bar closed. Appetizers stopped circulating. Richard Langford made frantic phone calls. Eleanor's face went from confusion to absolute fury when she realized what was happening. Hank and I stood outside that gate watching it all unfold. Guests began leaving. Some looked angry. Some looked embarrassed for the family. The Langfords' humiliation was visible even from where we stood. Then David appeared at the entrance. His tuxedo jacket was gone. His tie was loosened. He looked panicked. He ran to the gate. That's when the screaming started. "You ruined everything!" he shouted, gripping the bars so tight his knuckles went white. "Do you understand that? Everything." I asked him why he'd locked me out. Why did he tell them I wasn't allowed at my own son's wedding? David's words came out in a rush. He said the Langfords thought it would be better this way, that they didn't want certain people affecting the aesthetic of the day, that he thought I'd understand eventually. I asked if he ever planned to tell me. David didn't answer. Vanessa appeared behind him. She was screaming that I'd destroyed their wedding, that I'd humiliated them in front of 300 people, that this was unforgivable. David stood there, and for a moment his face crumbled. He looked at me and said, "You don't belong here." The words sounded like something he'd been holding for years, like a truth he'd finally spoken out loud. I realized then that David hadn't shut me out because he hated me. He shut me out because he was ashamed of himself, of the life he came from, of pain he'd never learned to name. And instead of facing it, he'd tried to bury it. But buried things don't disappear. They just rot underneath the surface. Hank told David we were done. I didn't say anything else. We turned and walked back to our car. David stood at that gate watching us leave. He looked like a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. The 2 years that followed were the hardest of my life. No calls, no emails, nothing. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that David and Vanessa had gotten married quietly at a courthouse 3 months after the vineyard disaster, that the Langfords had refused to help salvage anything, that David and Vanessa had moved to a smaller city hours away, distancing themselves from both families. I wanted to reach out. Hank said to let David come to us when he was ready. Every holiday I set an extra plate at the table out of habit. Then I'd stare at it for a moment and put it away. Every birthday I wrote David a card. I never sent any of them. I grieved my son while he was still alive. What I didn't know was that David was falling apart, that his marriage was strained under the weight of what had happened. Vanessa blamed him for the humiliation and resented the distance from her family. That David had started seeing a therapist who kept asking about his childhood, about his mother, about the resentments he'd carried in silence for so many years. That slowly, painfully, David was starting to understand what he'd done, what he'd destroyed, and why. If this story is hitting home for you, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Have you ever lost someone not because they died, but because they chose to walk away? 2 years and 3 weeks after the wedding, I was in the kitchen when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it and froze. David stood there. He looked older than I remembered. Thinner. Tired. Vanessa stood beside him, holding a baby who couldn't have been more than 4 months old. I couldn't speak. David's eyes were red, like he'd been crying for miles. He said he was sorry, that he'd been sorry for 2 years but didn't know how to say it, that he'd spent months in therapy trying to understand why he'd done what he did, that he'd finally realized he'd been running from pain he'd never processed, and in running, he'd hurt the person who'd never deserved it. Vanessa spoke next. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the confidence I remembered from that day at the gate. She said she'd been wrong too. that she'd pushed David to hide his family because she was ashamed of her own insecurities, that watching the wedding fall apart had forced her to see how toxic her family's expectations were, how much damage they'd caused, that she'd spent 2 years learning who David really was, where he came from, and she was ashamed she'd ever asked him to pretend otherwise. David said he didn't expect forgiveness. He said he knew what he'd done was unforgivable, but he needed me to know the truth, that he'd carried resentment for years over things that weren't my fault, that he'd blamed me for working when I was working for him, that he'd mistaken my exhaustion for indifference when it was sacrifice, that therapy had shown him he'd built a narrative in his head that wasn't real, a story where I was the problem. And by the time he understood that the story was a lie, he'd already destroyed everything. He said the worst part was realizing I'd been right there the whole time, that if he'd just told me he was hurting, I would have listened. But he'd been too proud, too ashamed, too convinced that his pain made him weak. I stood there looking at my son, at the daughter-in-law who'd been part of the pain, at the grandchild I'd never met. I didn't know what to say. I invited them in. Hank came out of the back room and stopped when he saw them. The silence was heavy, uncomfortable. Then the baby made a small sound, and my eyes went to her. Vanessa asked if I wanted to hold her. I took little Lily Rose in my arms for the first time, and something inside me cracked open. We sat in the living room David had once been embarrassed by. The same couch, the same photos on the walls. Vanessa apologized directly. She said she'd let her family's values become her values, and she was working to unlearn that, to raise Lily differently. David explained everything. The lies he'd told the Langfords, the shame he'd carried about his childhood, the way he'd let fear control him, the therapy sessions where he'd finally spoken the resentments out loud and realized how distorted they were. I listened. I didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't. The hurt was still there, but I said I understood. That I wished he'd told me years ago, when the pain was small, instead of letting it grow into something that nearly destroyed us. That I wished I'd asked more, listened better, seen the signs I'd missed. David asked if we could start over. Not pretend the past didn't happen, but actually face it. Actually talk about the hard things instead of burying them. I said I didn't know if we could get back what we'd lost, but I was willing to try. We're still trying. David, Vanessa, and Lily visit once a month now, sometimes twice. The conversations are careful, honest, sometimes painful. David's learning to speak the things he used to bury, to name the hurt instead of letting it fester. I'm learning to listen without fixing, to ask questions instead of assuming. Hank's learning to trust again, to let David back in without waiting for the next betrayal. It's not perfect. Some days I still feel the sting of that gate, of being locked out of the biggest day of my son's life. Some days David still carries guilt so heavy he can barely look at me. But we're doing the work. The hard, messy, uncomfortable work of rebuilding what silence destroyed. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean the hurt disappears. It means choosing to face the truth together instead of running from it alone. I don't know if we'll ever get back what we lost. Those years are gone. But I know we're finally being honest. We're finally talking about the things that hurt instead of pretending they don't exist. And that's where real love begins. Not in perfection, in the mess, in the willingness to stay even when it's hard. Sometimes the people you sacrifice everything for decide you're not worth the cost. And sometimes they realize too late what they threw away. The question isn't whether you can forgive them. The question is whether they can do the work to deserve it. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Have you ever rebuilt a relationship after it was broken? What did it take to get there?